Millionaire saves a boy on the brink of death in the river. An unexpected meeting reveals hidden ties between their families. The businessman's curiosity leads him to a secret that will change his life. He discovers the boy is the weak spot of his greatest enemy. The small town of Golden Ridge woke up lazily under the morning sun when a luxurious car drove through its narrow streets, standing out from the local simplicity. Behind the wheel, Richard Thompson tried to ignore the headlines on his phone that still echoed his downfall in Chicago. At 45, the former president of one of the country's largest construction companies now sought the anonymity that only a small town could offer. The mansion he had rented was on the outskirts of town near Stone River, a peaceful place where he hoped to reorganize his thoughts and, most importantly, his life. As he unloaded his luggage, he observed the lush vegetation surrounding the property, so different from the skyscrapers he was used to. "Welcome, Mr. Richard." The cheerful voice of Mrs. Josephine, the housekeeper he had hired through the real estate agency, interrupted his moment of contemplation. "I've already set everything up as you asked. Breakfast is on the porch table." Richard forced a smile, still unaccustomed to the typical hospitality of the countryside. "Thank you, Mrs. Josephine. You didn't have to go through the trouble." "Not at all, it's my pleasure. And look, I made that cornmeal cake everyone here loves. You'll see. It's impossible to stay sad while eating my treats." The simplicity of that moment contrasted sharply with his former life. Just 3 months ago, Richard was leading meetings in glass-walled rooms at the top of a commercial building, deciding the fate of millions in investments. Now he found himself sitting on a wooden porch, sipping homemade coffee while watching birds fly over the river. The sound of flowing water had a calming effect he hadn't expected. Perhaps Michael, his therapist, had been right to suggest this retreat. "You need to reconnect with yourself, Richard," he had said, "away from the pressures, the accusations, the judgmental stares." His thoughts were interrupted by Mrs. Josephine, who returned with more coffee. "You'll see how good the people here are. You just need to give them a chance." "I'm not sure I'm ready to meet new people, Mrs. Josephine. I came here for peace." "Ah, but peace can get monotonous if you don't have anyone to share it with, don't you think?" The woman smiled, her eyes revealing a wisdom that only years could bring. "And here everyone helps each other. It's different from the city." Richard sipped his coffee, reflective. The past few weeks in Chicago had been a nightmare. The accusations of mismanagement, the sensationalist headlines, the old friends who suddenly became strangers. Everything had crumbled so quickly that he barely had time to process it all. "Do you like fishing?" Mrs. Josephine's question brought him back to the present. "Stone River is famous for its lambarry fish. Every Sunday people come just for that." "I've never fished in my life." Mrs. Josephine: "It's never too late to start, Mr. Richard. Sometimes we find joy in the simplest things." The morning lazily progressed, and Richard decided to explore the surroundings of the property. The path to the river was marked by a well-kept trail, shaded by ancient trees. The air had a different scent there, a mix of wet earth and wildflowers. Reaching the riverbank, he found a rustic wooden bench, the kind made from logs. He sat down, letting the sound of the water wash over his mind. It was strange how the silence, which had bothered him so much in his Chicago apartment, felt natural and comforting here. The sound of footsteps alerted him. Turning around, he saw a boy, no more than 10 years old, carrying a handmade fishing rod. The boy stopped when he saw him, clearly surprised by the presence of a stranger. "Hi, mister. Are you the new resident of the big house?" the boy asked, his eyes shining with curiosity. "Yes, I am. My name is Richard. I'm Luke. Everyone calls me Little Luke." The boy approached without any hesitation. "Do you know how to fish?" "Actually, no. I can teach you. It's easy, you know. My mom says I'm the best young fisherman in town." Luke spoke with the typical pride of childhood, making Richard smile genuinely for the first time in weeks. "Does your mom let you come fishing alone?" "Oh, she trusts me. And our house is right over there, see?" Luke pointed to a modest building, barely visible among the trees. "And I can swim really well." Richard watched the boy prepare his fishing rod with a surprising dexterity for his age. There was something special about that boy, a contagious joy that seemed to light up everything around him. "You came from the capital, right? "I can tell by the way you talk," Luke commented while adjusting the bait. "It must be very different from here." "Yes, very different." "And why did you come here? There aren't any big buildings or malls here." The innocent question made Richard hesitate. How to explain to a child that he was running away, that he had lost everything he had built over the years because of a conspiracy he still didn't fully understand. "I came looking for some peace, little Luke. Sometimes we need a change of scenery." "Ah, like when I'm sad and come to the river? My mom says the water takes away the sadness." "Yeah, something like that." Richard smiled, surprised by the wisdom in those childish words. The rest of the morning passed quickly, with Luke patiently teaching Richard the secrets of handmade fishing. The simplicity of that moment, the boys' carefree laughter, the sun playing on the water's surface, all contributed to a feeling of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. When the sun began to grow stronger, Luke gathered his things. "I need to go, Uncle Richard. My mom doesn't like it when I'm late for lunch. Of course, I don't want you to get into trouble. And thank you for the fishing lesson. I'll come back tomorrow, then I can teach you how to make a rod like mine." Watching the boy walk away, Richard felt something different in his chest, a lightness that didn't match the weight of the past few weeks. Perhaps Mrs. Josephine was right. Peace didn't have to mean loneliness. The days in Golden Ridge began to settle into a routine that Richard Thompson hadn't expected to enjoy so much. Every morning after the coffee prepared by Mrs. Josephine, he would walk to the river, where he invariably found Luke with his infectious smile and endless stories about the adventures of a boy from the countryside. That particular morning, the sky was heavy and a fine drizzle fell over the town. Richard hesitated to take his usual walk, but something urged him to keep the silent commitment he had made to the young fisherman. He put on a light jacket and followed the now familiar trail. The river looked different, its waters more turbulent due to the rain over the past few days. Richard noticed that the water level had risen considerably, covering part of the rocks where they usually sat. He looked around, hoping not to find Luke on such an unsuitable day for fishing. His fears were confirmed when he spotted the boy, already on the riverbank holding his inseparable fishing rod. "Luke, don't you think it's too dangerous today?" "Not at all, Uncle Richard. The fish are easier to catch when the river's like this," the boy replied, waving enthusiastically. "Even so, you should step back from the edge. The current looks strong." Luke took a few steps back, but his gaze was fixed on something floating near the bank. "Look, I think that's the ball I lost last week." Before Richard could react, the boy leaned over a slippery rock, stretching his arm to reach the object. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Luke's foot slipped, and his small body lost its balance. Richard didn't think. He acted on instinct. In seconds, he was in the water, fighting against the current that was pulling the boy. The intense cold pierced through his clothes, but his mind was focused solely on reaching Luke. With a few vigorous strokes, he managed to grab the boy's arm and pull him close. The struggle back to the shore was a battle against the river's force, but Richard didn't let go of Luke for a second. When they finally reached solid ground, both were gasping for breath and shivering from the cold. "Are you okay?" Richard asked, checking the boy for any injuries. Luke coughed a few times before answering. "I'm fine. I'm sorry, Uncle Richard. I shouldn't have—" "Luke!" A desperate cry cut through the air. A woman was running toward them, her dark hair flying in the wind. "My God, what happened?" "Mom!" Luke ran into the woman's arms and she held him tightly. Richard watched the scene, still catching his breath. The woman looked to be around 35, and there was something familiar about her features that he couldn't quite place. Her eyes, though red from held-back tears, had a striking intensity. "He fell into the river, but he's fine now," Richard explained, struggling to his feet. "I'm Richard Thompson, the new—" "I know who you are," the woman interrupted, her voice carrying an unexpected tension. "Luke, let's go home. You need to change before you catch a cold." "But Mom, Uncle Richard saved me. He jumped into the water and—" "We'll talk about this later," she cut him off, her expression softening as she looked at her son. Turning to Richard, she added with visible reluctance, "Thank you for helping my son. No need to thank me. Luke is a great kid. He's been keeping me company these days." The mention of their friendship seemed to unsettle the woman even more. "Luke, you shouldn't be talking to strangers. We've already discussed this." "But Mom, Uncle Richard isn't a stranger. He came from Chicago and—" "Enough, Luke!" The sharpness in her voice surprised both the boy and Richard. Softening her tone, she continued, "Let's go home, okay? Your father should be arriving for lunch soon." The mention of Luke's father caused a visible shift in the woman's posture. Her shoulders tensed, and something in her eyes, fear perhaps, caught Richard's attention. "Can I say goodbye to Uncle Richard?" Luke asked in a small voice. His mother hesitated for a moment before nodding. Luke ran over and hugged Richard, soaking his already drenched clothes even more. "Thank you for saving me, Uncle. Take care, Champ, and be more careful next time, okay?" As he watched mother and son walk away, Richard felt a growing unease. The woman's reaction had been more than just maternal concern. There was something else there, something that didn't fit with the peaceful atmosphere of Golden Ridge. On his way back home, he found Mrs. Josephine on the porch, her face a mask of worry as she saw him soaked. "Good heavens, Mr. Richard, what happened?" As he recounted the incident, Richard noticed Mrs. Josephine's expression change when he mentioned Luke's mother. "Do you know his family?" "Everyone knows everyone here, Mr. Richard," Mrs. Josephine replied, avoiding his gaze as she busied herself with fetching dry towels. "But there are some things better left unsaid." "What do you mean?" "Look, Mr. Richard, you came here looking for peace, didn't you? So my advice is, stay away from that family, especially the boy's father." Mrs. Josephine's reluctance only fueled his curiosity. "Why? Who is his father?" "Edward Almeida." Mrs. Josephine said the name as if it left a bad taste in her mouth. "A very powerful man around these parts." The name echoed in Richard's mind like distant thunder. Edward Almeida. His hands tightened around the cup of tea Mrs. Josephine had prepared to warm him up after the river incident. Years of unanswered questions, sleepless nights replaying every detail of his downfall, and now his tormentor was here, just a few miles away. "Are you okay?" He turned pale suddenly, Mrs. Josephine asked, her voice heavy with concern. Richard forced a weak smile. "I am. Just tired from the effort at the river." He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Could you tell me more about the Almeidas?" The housekeeper adjusted her apron. A gesture Richard had already noticed was a sign of nervousness. "Well, Edward owns half of the productive land in the region. A traditional family, you know, one of those that has been here since the town was just a village. And his wife, Lucas's mother?" "Ah, Helen," Mrs. Josephine sighed deeply. "A sad story, if you want to know. She was such a lively young woman, a promising artist. She even had a gallery in Chicago, they say. But after the marriage..." She let the sentence hang in the air, her gaze lost in memories. "What happened after the marriage?" "Edward happened. Not that he is, well, he has his own way of doing things. The gallery closed, the brushes were put away, and Helen, she kind of disappeared into herself." Richard stood up, walking to the window. The rain was still falling outside, but less intensely now. "She seemed scared today when she came to pick up Lucas. And no wonder. Edward doesn't like her, or the boy having much contact with outsiders. He says it's to protect the family, but..." Mrs. Josephine shook her head. "You understand, right? Some protection is just a disguised prison." The housekeeper's words hit Richard like a punch. How many times had he wondered how Edward Almeida had managed to orchestrate his destruction with such precision? The answer was there. A man accustomed to controlling everything and everyone around him, turning protection into a prison. "There's a studio," Mrs. Josephine continued, breaking his thoughts. "At their house, all locked up, no one goes in. They say her last works are in there, covered with sheets. Lucas sometimes says he hears his mother crying in there late at night." Richard felt his heart tighten. The image of Helen, who already seemed fragile in their brief encounter, took on new contours of tragedy. "And no one ever tried to help?" "Help how, Mr. Richard? Edward Almeida practically supports the town, bank, city hall, police. Everyone owes him some favor. Who would interfere?" The rest of the afternoon dragged on as Richard tried to process all the information. In his room, he flipped through old folders of documents he had brought with him, not out of caution, but because he couldn't bring himself to part with the evidence of his downfall. Among contracts and reports, he found an old article about the opening of an art gallery in Chicago. In the black and white photo, a young Helen smiled, surrounded by her works. His laptop still held scanned clippings from the time of his scandal. In one of them, the name Edward Almeida appeared discreetly, almost like a footnote in a board meeting that decided his removal. How had he not noticed it before? A particularly loud thunderclap startled him. The storm had worsened, and the premature darkness of the afternoon turned the garden trees into menacing shadows. It was then that he noticed movement near the gate. Luke was standing there, drenched, holding something under his shirt. Richard rushed to open the gate. "Luke, what are you doing here in this weather?" The boy was shivering, but his eyes shone with determination. "I needed to show you something, Uncle Richard. It's important." Mrs. Josephine appeared with towels and a change of clothes she kept for when her grandchildren visited. As Luke dried off, Richard noticed that the object he was protecting was an old notebook, its pages slightly warped by the moisture. "I found it in my mum's studio," Luke explained, his voice low as if afraid of being overheard. "She never lets anyone in there, but today the door was open just a little." Richard carefully took the notebook. It was a diary, its pages filled with Helen's delicate handwriting. Among the text, small sketches danced in the margins. "Your name is here," Luke pointed to a specific page. "Look." Richard felt his heart skip a beat as he read the date. It was from 15 years ago, just a few months before his world fell apart. The text mentioned an exhibition in Chicago, a young businessman who had shown interest in her works, plans for a larger gallery. "Luke, does your mom know you took this?" The boy shook his head. "But she seemed so sad today after we came back from the river. She locked herself in the studio all afternoon. I just wanted to understand." Richard closed the diary, his mind racing. "You need to return this, Luke, before anyone notices." "But Uncle Richard..." "I promise I'll try to help your mom, okay? But this diary is something very personal to her. We need to respect that." As he helped Luke put the diary in a plastic bag to protect it from the rain, Richard felt the pieces of a puzzle starting to come together. Helen wasn't just the wife of his enemy. She was a connection to his past, a possible key to understanding the conspiracy that had destroyed his life. The news of Richard Thompson's presence in Golden Ridge spread like wildfire. The morning after the incident, at the river, the small-town cafe buzzed with whispers and curious glances as he entered to buy bread. "How you're very brave," the young cashier commented as she wrapped the bread. "Everyone is talking about what you did for the Almeida boy." Richard noticed how the surname was spoken with a mix of respect and fear. It was nothing. Anyone would have done the same. "Not around here," a man's voice sounded behind him. "No one usually messes with the Almeida family." Turning around, Richard found a middle-aged man who introduced himself as Charles, the town pharmacist. His face bore deep lines of worry as he continued, "Edward doesn't like outside interference, if you know what I mean." Before Richard could respond, the cafe door opened and a heavy silence fell over the room. Helen Almeida entered, her hesitant steps contrasting with the natural elegance of her posture. She wore a simple dress, but there was something in her bearing that betrayed her artistic background. Her eyes met Richard's for a brief moment, and he noticed a flicker of recognition that went beyond the incident from the day before. She remembered too. "Mrs. Almeida," the attendant quickly stepped out from behind the counter. "The usual?" Helen nodded softly, her fingers nervously playing with the strap of her bag. Richard noticed paint stains on her hands. She still painted, hidden away in her forbidden studio. "Is your son okay?" he asked, breaking the tense silence. "He is," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. "Thanks to you." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "Richard Thompson, I remember you from the gallery in Chicago." The cafe seemed to freeze. All eyes were fixed on them, ears tuned to every word. 15 years is a long time, Richard replied carefully. "Things have changed a lot since then." "Not everything," Helen said as she picked up her order and headed for the door, but she stopped before leaving. Some things remain exactly as they were, or get worse. After she left, the chatter resumed with renewed intensity. Charles, the pharmacist, approached Richard again. "Did you know Mrs. Helen before?" "Briefly. I saw some of her works in Chicago, a long time ago. She was different back then," Charles commented, his gaze lost in memories. "Every now and then she'd come to the pharmacy to buy painting supplies. She had a spark in her eyes, you know. After the marriage—" He shook his head sadly. Richard left the cafe with more questions than answers. On his way back, he noticed a black car parked near the mansion. A tall man, impeccably dressed, was leaning against the fence. Richard Thompson. Edward Almeida smiled, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. "What a coincidence to run into you here." "Coincidence?" Richard kept his voice neutral. "In a small town like this? I came to thank you in person for saving my son." Edward stepped closer, his presence exuding calculated authority. "And also, to offer some friendly advice." "I don't need advice, Edward." "Oh, but you do." Edward's smile widened, predatory. "Golden Ridge is a quiet, traditional town. It's no place for people with complicated histories. Are you threatening me?" "Imagine that. I'm just concerned for your well-being. After all, your reputation is already so fragile. It would be a shame if more unpleasant stories started circulating." Richard felt his blood boil, but maintained his composure. "Still digging into people's pasts, Edward. I thought you'd already done enough damage." "I'm just protecting what's mine." Edward adjusted his impeccable suit jacket. "My family, my town, my interests, understand?" "Your family?" Richard couldn't contain the sarcasm. "Is that how you see Helen? As property?" Edward's smile vanished. "Don't mention my wife's name. You don't have that right." "And does she have any rights? To paint, for example?" Edward took a step forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Be careful, Thompson. You've already lost everything once. Don't force me to get more creative." At that moment, Mrs. Josephine appeared on the porch. "Mr. Richard, lunch is ready." She stopped when she saw Edward, her face paling. "I'm coming." "Mrs. Josephine," Richard replied, not taking his eyes off Edward. "Mr. Almeida was just leaving." Edward stepped back, his artificial smile returning. "Think about what I said, Thompson. Golden Ridge can be a paradise or a hell, depending on the choices you make." As he watched the black car drive away, Richard felt a growing determination in his chest. Edward Almeida had destroyed his life once, and now he kept Helen imprisoned in a gilded cage. The issue was no longer just about revenge or justice. It was about liberation. Mrs. Josephine waited on the porch, her hands nervously twisting her apron. "Mr. Richard, for heaven's sake, don't provoke that man." "Don't worry, Mrs. Josephine." Richard entered the house, his mind already formulating plans. "Some battles need to be fought, even when they seem impossible. But you came here seeking peace." "That's true." Richard stopped on the stairs, turning to the housekeeper. "But sometimes peace only comes after we face our demons." Helen was in her studio when the first light of morning began to seep through the cracks of the always closed window. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed the sheet covering an unfinished canvas. The last one she had started painting before Edward decided her art didn't suit the family's social standing. The encounter with Richard at the cafe had awakened memories she had fought so hard to bury. The gallery in Chicago, the buzz of the vernissages, the pure joy of creating something from nothing, and most of all, the feeling of freedom she experienced in front of a blank canvas. "Mom?" Luke's voice startled her. "Can I come in?" Helen quickly covered the canvas again. "Of course, my love." Luke entered hesitantly, his eyes scanning the room he was rarely allowed to visit. "Why don't you paint anymore?" The question, so innocent, struck Helen like an arrow. "It's complicated, son. Uncle Richard said you were famous in Chicago, that your paintings were special." Helen froze. When did he tell you that?" "Yesterday, after he saved me. He remembered seeing your paintings in a gallery." Luke approached a stack of covered canvases. "Can I see?" "No." The response came out harsher than she intended. Softening her tone, she continued, "Not today, sweetheart. These paintings, they belong to the past." "But why does it have to be like that? Does Dad not let you paint?" Helen felt her heart tighten. How could she explain to a child that some prisons don't have visible bars? That sometimes the strongest chains are made of veiled threats and subtle manipulations. "Luke, there are things you're still too young to understand." She approached her son, straightening his slightly crumpled shirt. "Your father, he has his own way of seeing the world." "But he's wrong," Luke protested. "You get sad in here. I hear you crying sometimes." Helen felt her eyes well up. She thought she had been discreet in her moments of weakness, that she could keep her mask of serenity intact. But of course Luke, with his sharp sensitivity, had noticed. "Promise me something?" She held her son's hands. "Don't tell your father about Uncle Richard or about my paintings. It's important." "Because of their fight?" Helen frowned. "What fight?" "I heard Dad on the phone yesterday. He was angry, saying Uncle Richard shouldn't have come here, that it would cause problems." Luke hesitated before continuing. "He also said your name, Mom. He seemed worried." Worried wasn't quite the word, Helen thought. Edward didn't worry. He controlled. Every aspect of their life was carefully monitored. Every social interaction precisely calculated to maintain the appearance of a perfect marriage. "Mom!" Luke's voice brought her back to the present. "Can I tell you a secret?" "Of course, my love. I took your old diary yesterday, just for a little while," he added quickly, seeing his mother's alarmed expression. "I already put it back. It's in the drawer. But I read some parts." Helen felt her stomach sink. "Luke, you were happy before, weren't you? In the diary stories, you were always smiling, making plans." He looked at the covered canvases. Why did everything change? The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Helen walked to the window, opening a small gap in the curtains. Outside, the world continued its normal course. Birds flew. People passed by. Life flowed freely. "Sometimes, son, we make choices thinking they're the best at the time," she finally said. "And when we realize they weren't, it's already too late to change." "It's never too late." Luke repeated the words he had heard from Richard. "You could start painting again." "I won't tell Dad." Helen smiled sadly. "It's not that simple." "Because of what happened in Chicago, with Uncle Richard." She turned abruptly. "What do you know about that?" "Only what I read in the diary. That he was going to help you open a bigger gallery, that he had plans." Luke frowned, trying to remember. But then it suddenly stopped. The pages after that only talked about Dad. Helen felt a wave of nausea. That diary contained more than memories. It contained evidence. Evidence of how Edward had manipulated everything, how he had used his influence to destroy not only Richard, but also her own dreams. "Luke, I need you to promise me one more thing." She knelt in front of her, son holding his shoulders gently. "Don't mention this diary to anyone ever. It's very important." "Not even to Uncle Richard?" "Especially not to him." Helen hesitated. "Some truths are dangerous, my love. And your father, he doesn't like it when people find out certain things." A noise downstairs startled them. Edward's deep voice echoed through the house. "Helen, Luke!" "Go on, son." Helen kissed the boy's forehead. "Your father can't know you were here." After Luke left, Helen locked the studio door again. Her hands trembled as she opened the drawer where she kept the diary. The yellowed pages held more than memories. They were silent witnesses to a time when she still believed in dreams. Sitting on the floor, surrounded by covered canvases that were like ghosts of her former life, Helen began to cry. Not for what she had lost, but for what Luke had said. It's never too late. For the first time in years, a small flame of hope began to burn in her chest. The public library in Golden Ridge was a modest building, but its archives held the town's history like a well-protected treasure. Richard spent the entire morning there, sifting through old newspapers and public records, trying to better understand the Almeida family's influence in the region. Looking for something specific, the librarian, a woman with thick glasses named Margaret, asked as she organized some files. "Actually, yes." Richard hesitated before continuing. "I'd like to know more about the Almeida family. especially about Edward and Helen's marriage. Margaret adjusted her glasses, glancing nervously around before leaning closer. You're not from around here, so you might not know, but this is a delicate subject. Why? Helen's father, Anthony Silver, owned one of the largest farms in the area, but she had serious financial problems. She lowered her voice even further. Edward Almeida appeared as a savior, offering help. A few months later, Helen was married to him. Richard made some notes in his notebook. And her family? Her father. Well, he had an accident shortly after. Her mother moved to the coast. Helen was left alone, completely dependent on Edward. The pieces were starting to fall into place, the same pattern Edward had used against him, first approaching as an ally, then manipulation, and finally, total destruction. What about the art gallery in Chicago? Margaret's face lit up for a moment. Ah, that time was magical. Helen exhibited her works here in the library before going to Chicago. She had extraordinary talent. Her expression darkened. But Edward never really approved. He said art was a hobby, not a suitable profession for his wife. Richard flipped through a few more newspapers, stopping at a headline that caught his attention. Local businessman expands business to Chicago. The date coincided with the period when his construction company began to face problems. Mrs. Margaret, do you remember any conflicts between Edward and other businessmen in Chicago? The librarian paled. It's better not to stir that hornet's nest, Richard. Some things are safer left in the past. The past has an interesting way of catching up to us, don't you think? Before she could respond, Charles, the pharmacist Richard had met at the cafe, entered the library. His face was tense. Richard, I need to talk to you in private. They moved to a more secluded corner among the shelves. Charles seemed nervous, his restless hands betraying his anxiety. Edward is spreading stories about you around town, saying, you came here to cause trouble, that you have a suspicious background. He always uses the same tactic, Richard remarked bitterly, destroying reputations with rumors and half-truths. It's not just that. Charles hesitated. He's bringing up what happened to others who tried to stand up to him. The former mayor, for example, who tried to investigate some irregularities, ended up resigning after his family started suffering strange accidents. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. Is he threatening people? Not directly. Edward never leaves a trace, but the message is clear. No one should help you. Why are you telling me this then? Aren't you afraid? Charles sighed deeply. I do, but I also have a debt to Helen. She helped me once when my pharmacy was about to go bankrupt. She convinced Edward not to collect on my debt. He looked directly into Richard's eyes. And I also know what Edward did to you in Chicago. Richard straightened up in his chair. How? I work with controlled medications. Edward has influence over which pharmacies can sell certain drugs. One day he was agitated. He said more than he should have. He mentioned how he had taken care of a nosy businessman in Chicago who was too interested in his future wife. The implications of that revelation made Richard feel dizzy. It hadn't just been business revenge, it had been personal. Does Helen know about this? I think so, at least she suspects it. Charles glanced nervously at the door. But she lives in a gilded prison. Edward controls every aspect of her life. The people she talks to, the places she goes, even the medications she takes. Medications? For anxiety, depression? It started right after the wedding. Charles lowered his voice even further. But in the last few days since you arrived, she's been coming to the pharmacy less often. And when she does, her eyes look different. More alive. Richard processed the information in silence. Helen wasn't just a connection to his past. She was a victim just like him, trapped in a web of manipulation and control that had lasted 15 years. What do you plan to do? Charles asked. The truth needs to come out, Richard replied, his determination growing. Not just for me, but for Helen too. It's going to be dangerous. Edward has eyes and ears everywhere. Some fights are worth the risk. Richard put away his notes. And besides, I have something Edward doesn't. What's that? Nothing to lose. Richard smiled sadly. He already took everything from me once. Now it's my turn to show that the truth, no matter how hard we try to bury it, always finds a way to surface. On Sunday morning, the central square of Golden Ridge was bustling with the traditional craft fair. Luke had insisted that Helen take him, arguing that he needed to buy materials for a school project. What she didn't expect was to find Richard there, chatting animatedly with a group of local artisans. "Uncle Richard," Luke shouted, letting go of his mother's hand and running toward the businessman before Helen could stop him. "Hey, champ." Richard smiled, but his gaze was fixed on Helen, who remained standing a few meters away, clearly torn between approaching or leaving. "Mom, come here," Luke called. "Uncle Richard was talking about art with Mrs. Cindy." Helen approached hesitantly, aware of the curious glances from the residents around them. Cindy, a woman known for her colorful tapestries, smiled warmly. "Helen, dear, we were just talking about your old paintings. Richard told me he saw some in Chicago." "That was a long time ago," Helen replied softly, her hands nervously twisting. "Time doesn't erase talent," Richard remarked. "I still vividly remember that series about Brazilian rivers. The way you captured the light on the water was extraordinary." Helen felt her cheeks flush. It had been years since anyone had spoken about her art with such enthusiasm and knowledge. "Do you have any pictures?" Luke asked eagerly. "Mom won't. Let me see the old paintings." A tense silence fell over the group. Cindy, sensing the delicacy of the situation, suggested showing Luke some of her new tapestries. When they were relatively alone, Helen finally found the courage to speak. "Why are you doing this, Richard?" "Doing what?" "This, talking about my paintings, bringing up these memories." She glanced around nervously. "Edward won't like it." "And when was the last time you did something without thinking about his approval?" The question hit Helen like a slap. Her eyes filled with restrained tears, but her voice remained steady. "You don't understand, it's not that simple." "Then explain it to me." Richard took a step toward her. "Why did you let him destroy your dreams?" "His dreams were bigger," Helen replied bitterly, "and more powerful." Luke came running back, at that moment carrying a small tapestry. "Mom, look, Mrs. Cindy taught me how to make some stitches. Can I buy materials to try at home?" Her son's enthusiasm was contagious, and Helen found herself smiling genuinely. "Of course, my love, but we'll have to keep it in your room, okay? Why not in your studio? There's so much space there." "Luke," the warning tone in Helen's voice made the boy fall silent. Richard watched the interaction with interest. "You know, Luke, your mom used to teach art classes for kids in Chicago." The boy's eyes widened. "Really, Mom? You never told me." "There were a lot of different things back then," Helen replied softly. "Like what?" "Like your mom smiling more," Richard commented. "Like her being free to create, to teach, to be herself." Helen felt her heart race. Richard's words were like keys, unlocking long locked doors in her memory. "Dad would never allow it," Luke said sadly. "He says art doesn't lead to a future for anyone." "Your dad says a lot of things, Luke." Richard knelt to be at the boy's level. "But sometimes adults are wrong." Helen realized she needed to cut the conversation before it went too deep. "Luke, we need to go. Your dad will be here for lunch." "But Mum..." "Now, Luke." Richard stood up, his eyes meeting Helen's. "You know where to find me if you need to talk." Helen nodded slightly before taking Luke's hand. As they walked away, the boy waved enthusiastically at Richard. "He's different, isn't he, Mom?" Luke commented as they walked. "He's not afraid of Dad like everyone else." Helen felt a tightness in her chest. "That's exactly what worries me, son." Back at home, Helen automatically headed to the studio. Her hands trembled as she removed the sheet from a specific canvas, the last one she had painted before Edward banned her art. It was an unfinished self-portrait, her eyes on the canvas still glowing with hope and determination. Luke had followed her silently. "Why don't you finish it, Mom?" "It's not that simple, son." "Uncle Richard thinks it is. He said talent doesn't die, it just sleeps." Helen turned to her son, surprised. "When did he tell you that?" "The day he saved me. He said he saw that special light in you from the very first time, back in Chicago." Luke hesitated before continuing. "He also said that some people are afraid of this light because it reveals truths they want to hide." Her son's words resonated deeply with Helen. She remembered how Edward had gradually dimmed her light, convincing her that her art was inadequate. Childish, a silly pastime that didn't suit her social standing. "Mum," Luke's voice brought her back to the present. "Do you still have those paints I gave you for your birthday?" Helen nodded, pointing to a locked drawer. "Then use them. Just a little. Dad doesn't need to know." Before she could respond, they heard the sound of Edward's car arriving. Helen quickly covered the canvas and pushed Luke toward the door. "Go, son. And remember, not a word about today." Alone in the studio, Helen looked at her hands, stained with dried paint from days past. Richard's words echoed in her mind. "When was the last time you did something without thinking about his approval?" With trembling hands, she opened the drawer of paints. Maybe Luke was right. Maybe she could paint just a little, hidden as a secret act of rebellion. As a first step toward the light she had lost. The oldest law firm in Golden Ridge was located in a colonial townhouse on the main street. Richard had arranged a meeting with Dr. Adam, a retired lawyer, who, according to Charles, held important secrets about the Almeida family's business dealings. "I knew someone would come asking these questions someday," the lawyer remarked, serving coffee in antique cups. "I just didn't expect it to be you, Richard Thompson." "Why not?" "Because Edward was very careful in destroying your reputation. I thought we'd never hear from you again." Adam rummaged through a drawer, pulling out a yellowed folder. "But I kept these documents anyway, just in case." Richard examined the papers with growing attention. They were contracts, deeds, and, most importantly, correspondences between Edward and various businessmen from Chicago. "This proves he planned it all," Richard murmured, reading the dates. "The supposed crisis in my company, the rumors of mismanagement. And more than that," Adam pointed to a specific letter. "Look at the date. It's from before he met Helen at her gallery." Richard felt his heart race as he read the contents. Edward had already researched Helen, her family, her father's financial struggles. It hadn't been a chance encounter. It had been a meticulously planned ambush. "Why are you showing me this now?" The lawyer sighed deeply. "I'm old, Richard. I'm tired of carrying these secrets. And mostly I'm tired of seeing Helen wither away in that house. Did you know her before?" "I knew the entire Silver family. Good people, artists by nature. Her father, Anthony, was an upright man who fell into a financial trap orchestrated by Edward." Dr. Adam took a sip of coffee. "When Helen got married, we thought it was for love. Only later did we understand that she was sacrificing herself to save her father." "And her father's accident?" "It wasn't an accident," Dr. Adam said gravely. "But no one was ever able to prove anything. Edward is very good at making things seem natural." A noise in the reception area interrupted them. Dr. Adam's secretary hurried in. "Doctor, Edward Almeida is coming up." Richard quickly tucked the documents into his briefcase, but Dr. Adam stopped him. "Take only the copies. The originals. Stay with me in a safe place." He barely had time to hide in the bathroom attached to the office when Edward's voice filled the room. "Adam, my old friend, what a surprise to find you working on a Saturday." "Some cases can't wait, Edward." "Cases? I thought you were retired." "You never really retire from the law, you know that." Richard could feel the tension in the lawyer's voice. Through the crack in the door, he watched Edward walk around the office, examining every detail with his predator's eyes. "I heard you've been digging through the old files," Edward commented casually. "Just nostalgia. As we get older, the past becomes more interesting. As long as certain parts of the past stay where they belong, buried." The veiled threat in Edward's voice was clear. "Don't worry. I know very well what should or shouldn't come to light." Edward stopped in front of the desk, picking up one of the half-empty coffee cups. "2 cups, Adam?" "My secretary was here just a moment ago." "Interesting, because I saw her leaving for lunch when I arrived." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard held his breath, aware that the slightest noise would give him away. "You know, Adam," Edward continued, his voice dangerously soft, "I've always admired your discretion. It would be a shame if, after all these years, you started making reckless choices." "I have nothing to fear, Edward. Not anymore." Everyone, Has something to fear, my friend, always. Edward walked to the door. Just make sure your old files remain filed. After Edward left, Richard waited a few minutes before emerging from his hiding place. Adam was pale but determined. He knows, Richard commented. He always knew this day would come, the lawyer replied, pouring himself more coffee with slightly trembling hands. But now you have what you need. Use it wisely. Why are you helping me? You're putting yourself at risk. Because I've seen Edward destroy too many lives. Helen, she was like a niece to me. Seeing her in that house, fading more each day. Adam shook his head sadly. Some things are worth the risk. Richard carefully stored the copies of the documents. I need to find a way to use this without compromising anyone. There's someone who can help, Adam hesitated. Edward's former secretary in Chicago, she kept all his secrets. She was fired right after you lost everything, but not before making her own backup copies. Do you know where I can find her? She lives in Jordan Fields now, works with crafts, ironically. Adam wrote an address on a piece of paper. But be careful, Edward has eyes everywhere. Leaving the office, Richard felt the weight of the documents in his briefcase as if he were carrying dynamite. They were enough evidence to expose Edward, but they were also too dangerous to use without a careful plan. His phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. I need to see you. It's urgent. H. Richard reread the message several times, his heart racing. Helen had never tried to contact him directly before. Something had changed. What he didn't know was that, at that very moment, Helen was in her studio finishing her first painting in 15 years, a portrait of Luke by the river, with Richard's figure in the background like a silent guardian. The old church in Golden Ridge stood at the highest point in town, surrounded by an overgrown garden that few visited. It was there that Helen asked to meet Richard, on a stone bench, partially hidden by flowering bushes. I needed to show you something, Helen said as soon as Richard sat beside her. Her hands trembled as she opened a worn leather folder. I found these letters hidden at the back of a drawer in Edward's office. Richard examined the yellowed papers with growing attention. They were letters exchanged between Edward and several businessmen from Chicago, dated 15 years ago. He planned it all, Helen continued, her voice choked. From the beginning, my father's debts weren't real. Edward forged documents, pressured banks, created a web of lies so elaborate that no one questioned it. Why? For power. Control. Helen took a deep breath. And for you. Richard furrowed his brow. What do you mean? Edward found out about us even before we officially met. That visit of yours to my gallery in Chicago. It wasn't a coincidence. That you showed up just when I was considering expanding the business. Helen, he knew you were interested in investing in the gallery, that we had plans. She wiped away a stubborn tear. Edward couldn't allow someone like you with resources and influence to get too close. So he orchestrated everything. My downfall, yours, the pressure on my father. Richard felt his heart tighten as he saw the pain in Helen's eyes. Why are you telling me this now? Because I can't stand living in this gilded prison anymore. She pulled something else from the folder, a small sketchbook. I started painting again, in secret. Luke inspired me with his courage, his innocence. And then I realized I needed to have the same courage. The pages of the sketchbook revealed delicate sketches, Luke fishing, the river at different times of the day, and to Richard's surprise, some portraits of himself. They're beautiful, Helen. They're more than that. They're my declaration of independence. She closed the sketchbook carefully. But Edward found out last night while I was in the studio. He walked in unannounced. Richard felt a chill of concern. Did he hurt you? Not physically. Edward is more subtle than that. Helen smiled sadly. He just stood there, watching my work, with that cold gaze of his. Then he said it was time for me to remember my place, the consequences of my choices. What consequences? Luke, Helen's voice trembled. Edward threatened to send our son to a boarding school in Switzerland. He said the boy clearly needs a more appropriate education. Richard felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. He can't do that. Oh, he can. He has all the legal power, all the money, all the connections. Helen stood up, walking to the edge of the garden. But this time, he made a mistake. What mistake? Threatening me using Luke. She turned, and Richard saw a fierce determination in her eyes. I can endure anything he does to me, but with my son? No. Richard approached, resisting the urge to hug her. I have evidence against him too. Documents that prove the manipulation in Chicago, the sham of your father's debts. It's not enough. Helen shook her head. Edward has people everywhere, influence over judges, politicians. So what do you suggest? A trap. Helen smiled, a smile reminiscent of the confident artist she once was. Edward has always boasted about being smarter than everyone, about never leaving a trace. But I spent 15 years observing, learning his patterns, discovering his weaknesses. And what is his weakness? Pride. Helen pulled another envelope from the folder. This is an invitation to a charity event he hosts every year. The cream of local society will be there, including people he can't control so easily, state politicians, out-of-town businessmen. Richard began to understand. A perfect stage. To expose the truth in a way he can't hide or manipulate, Helen finished. But I need your help. Alone, I don't have enough credibility. I'm just the submissive wife he molded all these years. It's risky, Helen. He could retaliate. I've thought of that too. She handed Richard another document. It's a power of attorney, granting my mother temporary custody of Luke if something happens to me. She's waiting in a nearby town, ready to pick him up if necessary. Richard examined the document, impressed by the level of planning. How long have you been preparing this? Since you arrived, Helen admitted softly. Your presence here, it was like something inside me awakened, as if the artist I was, the woman who dreamed of coloring the world, finally found the courage to resurface. A bell rang in the distance, marking the hour. Helen startled. I need to go. Edward expects me to be home when he returns from the club. Helen. Richard held her hand gently. Are you sure about this? She intertwined her fingers with his for a brief moment. For the first time in 15 years, I'm sure of something. It's not just for me or for you or even for Luke. It's for all the truths Edward buried, all the dreams he destroyed. Before leaving, Helen handed Richard one last thing, a small, rolled-up canvas. I finished it last night after Edward left the studio. Keep this safe, at least for now. Alone in the garden, Richard carefully unrolled the canvas. It was a self-portrait of Helen, but not the Helen of today. It was how she saw herself. In the future, free, her eyes shining with the same intensity they had 15 years ago. In the bottom corner of the canvas, a small inscription. Some prisons are built with iron bars, others with lies. But every prison, no matter how strong, has a weakness, the truth. The preparations for the Almeida charity event had transformed. Golden Ridge. Decorative banners stretched across the main streets. Florists worked tirelessly to fulfill orders, and the grand hall of the town's social club buzzed with activity. Richard watched the commotion from the window of his room in the mansion, mentally organizing every detail of the plan. On his bed, carefully selected documents formed a clear timeline of Edward's manipulation, from the false debts of Helen's, farther to the systematic destruction of Richard's construction company. Are you sure about this? Mrs. Josephine asked, entering with a tray of coffee. I've known Edward Almeida longer than you have. He's not the type to lose gracefully. Sometimes, Mrs. Josephine, it's not about winning or losing, Richard replied, picking up a cup. It's about doing the right thing no matter the cost. A car parked in front of the mansion. It was Charles the pharmacist, accompanied by Dr. Adam. Both had become crucial allies in recent days. Did you bring what I asked for? Richard inquired as soon as they entered. Charles handed over a manila envelope. All the medication records prescribed for Helen over the past 15 years, the amount of controlled substances. He shook his head, disturbed. And I brought this. Dr. Adam placed a folder on the table. Official records of Edward's suspicious transactions. My final contribution before retiring for good. Richard examined the new documents carefully. With this, we can prove he used medication to keep Helen under control. in addition to the financial manipulation. But we still need something more, Charles commented, something he can't deny or manipulate. And we have it. Richard grabbed his laptop, showing a series of emails. Edward's former secretary in Chicago didn't just keep copies of documents. She kept records of conversations, secret meetings, his entire strategy to destroy my company and force the marriage with Helen. How did you get this? Dr. Adam asked, impressed. Let's just say she's been waiting 15 years for a chance to do the right thing. The sound of small, hurried footsteps on the stairs interrupted the conversation. Luke came running in, his face red with excitement. Uncle Richard! Uncle Richard! Luke, what are you doing here? Richard approached the boy, concerned. Mom sent me to give you this. He held out a small flash drive. She said it's important that you'll know what to do. Richard carefully picked up the device. Does your mother know you came? She's the one who sent me, Luke smiled. She said I'm the only one who could do this without raising suspicions. Dad never suspects me. The adults exchanged worried glances. Using Luke as a messenger was risky, but also brilliant. Edward would never suspect his own son. There's one more thing, Luke continued, lowering his voice. Mom started painting again in secret, you know. But the paintings are different from the old ones. They have more strength, she said. Richard plugged the USB drive into the laptop. On the screen, dozens of photos appeared, meticulous records that Helen had kept over the years. Incriminating documents, recorded conversations, a true timeline of Edward's tyranny. She documented everything, Charles murmured, amazed. All this time, like an artist, Richard added, observing, recording, waiting for the right moment. Uncle Richard? Luke tugged on his sleeve. You're going to help Mom, right? She's been different lately, stronger but also more scared. Richard knelt down to be at the boy's eye level. I will, Luke, I promise, but I need you to promise me something too. What? Tomorrow, during the party, stay close to your grandmother. No matter what happens, don't leave her side. Luke nodded solemnly. Mum said the same thing. She said Grandma will take me for a walk if things get complicated. Mr. Richard, Mrs. Josephine gently interrupted. It's almost time for Luke to go back. We don't want to raise suspicions. As he watched the boy leave, Richard felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It wasn't just his reputation or Helen's freedom at stake. It was Luke's future. The truth buried for so long, the justice the whole town deserved. I'll need you all tomorrow, he addressed the others. Everyone has their part to play. If something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong, Charles interrupted. We've spent too much time being afraid of Edward Almeida. It's time to show that the truth is stronger than his power. Mrs. Josephine began collecting the empty cups, her hands slightly trembling. Just promise me one thing, Mr. Richard. Promise me you'll protect that boy. Luke is the only truly good thing to come out of this whole mess. I promise, Mrs. Josephine, Richard said, looking at the scattered documents. The flash drive containing the evidence gathered by Helen and the portrait she had given him. Tomorrow, when the sun sets over Golden Ridge, nothing will be the same. Outside, dark clouds were forming on the horizon, hinting at an approaching storm. It was as if even the sky knew that great changes were coming. The social club hall in Golden Ridge sparkled under the light of dozens of crystal chandeliers. The cream of local society mingled in their formal attire, champagne glasses clinking in superficial toasts, while an orchestra played soft classical music in the background. Helen looked stunning in a midnight blue dress, her impeccable posture masking the inner storm she felt. Beside her, Edward moved through the guests with his usual charm, the epitome of a successful businessman and dedicated philanthropist. Darling, Edward whispered during a brief pause in the conversations, where is Luke? With my mother, Helen replied serenely. You said yourself that events like these are tedious for children. Edward nodded, seemingly satisfied. Helen watched. As he walked away to greet a group of newly arrived politicians, her hands trembled slightly as she held her champagne glass and she took a deep breath, mentally rehearsing every detail of the plan. Richard arrived discreetly, wearing a dark suit that allowed him to blend into the elegant crowd. Some guests recognized him, whispering among themselves about his unexpected presence. After all, the Almeida charity event was for special guests only. "Your invitation, sir." A security guard blocked his entrance. Richard presented the golden card Helen had arranged for him. The man examined the invitation with extra care, clearly instructed to stay alert. "Everything is in order," a familiar voice intervened. It was Charles the pharmacist who was part of the event's organizing committee. "Mr. Thompson is my personal guest." Across the hall, Edward watched the scene with controlled interest. Helen noticed the exact moment he spotted Richard, a slight stiffening of his shoulders, a calculating glint in his eyes. "What a pleasant surprise," Edward commented, approaching Richard with an artificial smile. "I didn't know you attended charity events." "I've always supported good causes," Richard replied calmly, "especially when they involve transparency." The word hung in the air like a veiled threat. Edward kept his smile, but his eyes hardened. "Well, enjoy the party. Just remember, every place has its own rules of conduct." As the night progressed, the tension in the air grew subtly. Helen moved through the guests with studied grace, but her eyes occasionally met Richard's, exchanging silent signals. The crucial moment was approaching. On stage, the master of ceremonies announced that Edward would deliver his annual speech. Helen felt her heart race. It was time. "Good evening, everyone," Edward began, his voice resonating through the hall. "It is with great satisfaction that for the 15th consecutive year, we gather the Society of Golden Ridge for this noble cause." Helen discreetly moved toward the projection equipment. Richard, in turn, positioned himself near the main exit. Charles and Dr. Adam took their strategic places in the hall. "Our city has grown significantly over these years," Edward continued, "thanks to the traditional values we uphold: integrity, family, respect for institutions." It was then that the lights in the hall flickered briefly. On the screen behind Edward, where photos of charitable projects were supposed to be displayed, other images began to appear. Documents, contracts, emails, bank records, the web of Edward's manipulation exposed in high definition for all to see. "What is this nonsense?" Edward tried to maintain his composure, but his voice trembled slightly. "The truth, Edward," Helen spoke, her voice clear and firm, echoing through the silent hall. "The one you tried to bury for 15 years. The guests watched in stunned silence as the evidence unfolded on the screen. Records of the false debt of Helen's father. Documents proving the manipulation against Richard's company. Suspicious medical prescriptions. "Helen?" Edward stepped down from the stage, moving toward her with a chilling calm. "You don't know what you're doing." "I know. Perfectly well," she replied, standing her ground. "For the first time in 15 years, I know exactly what I'm doing." Richard approached, positioning himself beside Helen. "It's over, Edward. You can no longer bury the truth." The hall buzzed with shocked murmurs. Important politicians and businessmen began to discreetly distance themselves from Edward, like rats abandoning a sinking ship. "You think you can destroy me with a few documents?" Edward laughed, but it was a humorless laugh. "I built this city. I own half of it." "You own nothing but lies," Helen retorted. "And lies, Edward, are like sandcastles. Sooner or later, they crumble." The orchestra had stopped playing. The silence in the hall was deafening, broken only by the sound of the evidence continuing to play on the screen, each image a new crack in the carefully constructed facade of Edward Almeida. "The guests have seen enough," Richard remarked. "But there's more. Much more. Unless what?" Edward growled, his veneer of civility beginning to crack. "Unless you're ready to negotiate," Helen finished, her voice steady. "Starting with my freedom and Luke's." Edward looked around, assessing the situation. His closest allies had already strategically disappeared. The politicians present kept a safe distance. Even the security guards seemed hesitant about how to proceed. The mask of the benevolent philanthropist had fallen, and for the first time in 15 years, Edward Almeida found himself cornered by something his money and influence couldn't control: the truth. The social club's hall had emptied considerably. Only the main players in the drama remained, along with a few onlookers who kept a safe distance, witnessing the collapse of Edward Almeida's empire. "We can resolve this civilly," Edward said. His voice controlled, but his eyes betraying his desperation. "Helen, darling, let's talk at home as a family." "There is no family here, Edward," Helen replied. "There's only a prison you built with lies and manipulation." Richard stepped forward, holding a folder. "We have copies of everything, every document, every email, every bank record. If anything happens to Helen or Luke—" "Luke?" Edward interrupted, his mask of civility slipping. "Where is my son?" "Safe," Helen answered, "far from your manipulations." The mention of Luke seemed to awaken something in Edward. He moved toward the exit, but Charles and Dr. Adam blocked his path. "You're not going anywhere until we settle this," Richard declared. 15 years of lies are enough." Edward looked around the hall like a cornered animal searching for an escape. His eyes landed on Helen, and his expression shifted subtly. "You know what will happen if this goes public, don't you?" he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Your precious studio, your paintings, your art. Everything will be exposed, every secret, every moment of weakness." "It doesn't work anymore, Edward," Helen interrupted. "Your threats lost their power the moment I realized the strongest prison was my own fear." Outside the club, a small crowd was gathering. The news in Golden Ridge spread quickly, and the drama unfolding was too big to go unnoticed. "I have a proposal," Edward finally spoke, adjusting his tie nervously. "We can resolve this discreetly. An agreement." "There's no possible agreement," Richard interjected, "unless you're willing to accept our terms." "What terms?" Helen stepped forward, her posture upright, her eyes gleaming with determination. "First, my complete freedom and shared custody of Luke. Second, you will publicly admit to your manipulations in Chicago and clear Richard's name. Third, you will transfer a significant portion of your assets to social projects, real ones this time, not just fronts for money laundering." "Are you insane?" Edward laughed bitterly. "That would destroy me." "No, Edward. It would give you a chance at redemption." Helen picked up her phone. "The choice is yours. Accept our terms or all the evidence goes to the press right now. Every detail, every manipulation, every lie." The silence that followed was tense. Edward stared at Helen as if seeing her for the first time. The submissive woman he had shaped over 15 years had vanished, replaced by someone he barely recognized. "You don't understand," he began, his voice almost pleading. "Everything I did was for us, for our family." "No," Helen cut him off. "Everything you did was for power and control. Our family was never more than a facade for your manipulations." Richard watched the scene with a mix of admiration and concern. Helen was magnificent in her newfound strength, but he knew Edward well enough to understand that men like him rarely accept defeat gracefully. "You have 1 hour," Helen continued, her voice softening, "to decide. After that, there's no turning back." Edward loosened his tie, his face a mask of conflict. For the first time in his life, he was truly cornered. His empire of lies, so carefully built over the years, was about to crumble. "And Luke?" he finally asked. "What will you tell him?" "The truth," Helen replied simply. "Something you were never able to offer." Outside, the dawn light began to tint the sky pink. A new day was dawning in Golden Ridge, and with it the promise of change. 55 minutes, Edward," Richard remarked, glancing at his watch. "Time is passing." Helen walked to one of the windows in the hall, observing the city that was beginning to wake up. Somewhere out there, Luke was safe with his grandmother, shielded from the turbulence of this historic night. In her heart, a certainty grew. Regardless of Edward's choice, she was finally free. The truth, which had been her prison for so long, was now her liberation, and nothing nor anyone could change that. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows of the social club when Edward Almeida finally broke the silence that had settled. His face, usually a mask of absolute control, now revealed the marks of the inner conflict he was battling. "I need to see my son," he said, his voice stripped of its usual authoritative tone. "Not before you make your decision," Helen replied firmly. "Luke is safe, and he will remain so until we resolve everything." Edward walked to one of the windows, observing the small crowd that had gathered outside. Reporters from the local newspaper were already circulating, eager for information about the drama unfolding inside the club. "You don't understand," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "I built all of this from nothing. Every business, every connection, every deal. Built on lies," Richard interjected. "And lies, Edward, have an expiration date." Charles approached, holding his phone. "The first reporters from Chicago are already on their way. In a few hours, this story will explode with or without your cooperation." Edward turned slowly, his eyes meeting Helen's. For a moment, a glimpse of the past crossed his gaze, the young artist he had met in Chicago, so full of life and dreams. "Did you really paint again?" he asked softly. Helen nodded. "The studio was never just a locked room, Edward. It was the symbol of everything you tried to control. Show me." The request took everyone by surprise. Helen hesitated for a moment before opening her bag and pulling out some photographs, records of her most recent works. Edward examined the images in silence. They were powerful paintings, laden with emotion suppressed for years. One in particular caught his attention, a portrait of Luke by the river, his face illuminated by a pure joy. That contrasted with the shadows around him. "He has your talent," Edward commented, his voice choked. "I always knew that. Maybe that's why I tried so hard to control everything. Art is unpredictable, isn't it? It can't be tamed, calculated." "Like the truth," Helen finished. Edward placed the photos on a nearby table, adjusted his tie in an automatic gesture, and finally faced the group. "I have some conditions too." Richard and Helen exchanged tense glances. "First," Edward continued, "I want assurances that Luke won't hate me. That he'll know despite everything he hesitated, that I love him." "That will depend on your actions from here on out," Helen replied. "Luke is a smart boy. He'll understand in time if you show genuine remorse. Second, I want to be involved in managing the social projects, not to control, but—" He ran a hand over his face, tired. "Maybe it's time to build something real, something that doesn't need lies to sustain it." Dr. Adam, who had been silently observing, until then spoke up. "I can oversee that, and ensure everything is done within the law, with full transparency." Edward nodded slightly before continuing. "And third, I want you to finish that self-portrait, Helen. The one in the studio, covered by a sheet all these years." Helen felt tears forming in her eyes. That unfinished painting was the last one she had started, before Edward forbade her art, a symbol of her interrupted dreams. "Why?" "Because I need to see it. I need to understand what I destroyed, what I tried to control and couldn't." Edward took a deep breath. Maybe it's time to let the truth breathe. Richard watched the scene with a mix of emotions. The man who had ruined his life, who had manipulated so many people for so long, was finally showing signs of humanity. "Do we have a deal then?" he asked. Edward walked over to a nearby table and picked up a pen. "Bring the documents. Let's do this right, legally, transparently, as it should have been from the start." While Charles and Dr. Adam prepared the necessary papers, Helen approached Richard. "Do you think he'll follow through?" she whispered. "Not by choice," Richard replied, "but because he has no alternative. And sometimes, Helen, that's how change begins, not by desire, but by necessity." The sun was already high when the final documents were signed. Outside, the city of Golden Ridge was waking up to a new reality. The first rumors were already circulating, whispered stories about the fall of the great Edward Almeida, about truths revealed and lies exposed. But inside the social club, in the silence that followed the last signatures, something deeper was happening. It was the sound of invisible chains breaking, of masks falling, of truths finally coming to light. Helen picked up her phone and typed a short message. "It's done. Bring Luke home." It was time to start rebuilding, not on lies and manipulation, but on the solid foundation of truth, no matter how painful it might be. 6 months had passed since the night that changed Golden Ridge. Helen's studio, once a space of solitude and secrets, was now filled with light and life. The windows, permanently open, let in the gentle breeze that swayed the white curtains. "Mum, look!" Luke exclaimed, holding up a colorful drawing. Uncle Richard said I have your talent. Helen smiled, watching her son work at his own drawing desk, a gift from Richard. The space had been transformed into a shared studio, where mother and son could create freely. It's beautiful, sweetheart, but shouldn't you be getting ready? Your dad will be here in half an hour for the weekend. Luke nodded but kept drawing. The shared custody was working surprisingly well. Edward, against all odds, was making an effort to rebuild his relationship with his son in a healthier way. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Richard's arrival. After the events of that night, he had decided to stay in Golden Ridge, helping oversee the transformation of Edward's businesses into legitimate ventures. I brought the canvases you asked for, he said, carrying a package, and some news from Chicago. Helen set down her brushes and walked over. The gallery? They approved your exhibition. They want to open it next month. Richard smiled. Your new works made quite an impression. The self-portrait Edward had asked her to finish now occupied a prominent place in the studio, but it was no longer the same painting she had started 15 years ago. It was something new, deeper, marked by experience and liberation. Luke, have you packed your things yet? Helen called, noticing the time. Almost, the boy replied, focused on adding the final details to his drawing. It's a gift for Dad. Do you think he'll like it? Helen walked over to see. It was a portrait of the family, not as it had been, but as it was now. Edward was there, as were Richard, Mrs. Josephine, and even Charles and Dr. Adam, an expanded family, rebuilt on more truthful foundations. He'll love it, I'm sure, she said, kissing the top of her son's head. The sound of a car horn announced Edward's arrival. In the first months after the agreement, these moments had been tense, filled with hurt and discomfort. Now, though, there were still scars. There was also a mutual acceptance of the new reality. Son, your dad's here, Helen called. Luke quickly packed his things, grabbed his backpack and the drawing. Before leaving, he hugged Richard and his mother. See you Sunday, Mom. Bye, Uncle Richard. Helena walked him to the door. Edward was waiting in the car, simpler than his old limousines. The change in his appearance was noticeable. He seemed lighter, though older. Helena, he greeted with a nod. Richard. Edward, they replied in unison. Dad, look what I made. Luke ran to the car, eager to show his drawing. Helena watched as Edward examined his son's work, a genuine smile forming on his face. It's amazing, son. Let's hang it in the office. How about that? After they left, Helena returned to the studio. Richard followed her, carrying the new canvases. It's still strange sometimes, she commented, getting back to her work. Seeing him like this changed. People can change when they have no choice, Richard replied, starting to unpack the canvases. What matters is that Luke is happy. Helena nodded, dipping her brush into a vibrant blue. She was working on a new series, inspired by the transformation of Golden Ridge. The town, like her, was learning to breathe again. You know what Luke told me yesterday? She remarked, applying the paint with firm strokes. That he now understands why I used to paint in secret all those years. He said sometimes we need to keep our light hidden until we're strong enough to show it. Richard stepped closer, observing the work in progress. He's as wise as his mother. He's free as he should have always been. Helena smiled, continuing to paint, as we all should be. The afternoon sun streamed through the studio windows, creating golden patterns on the floor. On the canvas, colors blended and danced, telling stories of broken prisons and freed truths. Outside, Golden Ridge continued its life, transformed, but not diminished by the exposure of the truth. People still talked about that night at the social club, about how an empire built on lies had turned into something more genuine, more human. Do you think it was worth it? Richard asked softly. All the risk, all the exposure? Helena paused for a moment, contemplating her work. In the corner of the studio, the finished self-portrait watched her, no longer a prisoner, but a woman, who had found her strength in truth. The truth is always worth it, Richard, she replied, returning to her painting. Even when it hurts, even when it scares us, because only with it can we truly be free. And so, stroke by stroke, Helena continued to tell her story, no longer in whispers and shadows, but in vibrant colors and full light, as it always should have been.